Welcome back to FatbossTV. Today we finish our boss coverage of Uldir with the 6th boss in the instance, which is Reborn.
Yes, this two-phase encounter feels like a real step up over the previous 5 bosses in the instance, and it appears to be the first fight where a particular class is almost required. Phase 1 is an ad management phase, and phase 2 is a burn phase, where you need to kill the boss off before you run out of platform to work with. Now with all of these boss previews, let's jump straight into phase 1.
So Zul in this phase will primarily cast Shadow Barrage. This deals damage to a random player in your raid. It's unavoidable and therefore just needs to be out-healed throughout the entire phase. Zul will however still melee hit, so you will need a tank to pick him up. More impactful is the Pools of Darkness. One of these pools will be up almost constantly throughout the fight. These pools deal extremely large ticking damage to the entire raid until they despawn. However, if a player stands within it, the raid damage will be prevented and instead the single player will take small bursty damage every 2 seconds. As these pools spawn randomly throughout the encounter space, we deemed it unviable to assign players to them, instead just had any players nearby go and soak them. Last to mention in Zul's toolkit is Dark Revelation. This 10-second debuff causes large raid-wide damage when it expires. It does however drop off with distance. As soon as a player receives the debuff, they'll want to move as far away from the raid as possible, right up against the edges. On top of the raid-wide damage, you'll also have 5 minion of Zul ads spawn from the debuff player. These ads will fixate and chase down a random player and causes all players within 5 yards of their target to be feared for 12 seconds. This fear is a curse, so it can be dispelled by shamans. You can however kill the ads by removing their Bound by Shadow buff. This is a large absorption shield, so you can just DPS it until it's removed, but it is a magical debuff, so you can just master spell it, which will instantly kill all 5 of the ads. On Heroic, you'll have to deal with 2 Dark Revelation debuffs at the exact same time, so we simply countered that just by having 2 priests. You can also individually dispel the ads with things like Purge, which isn't ideal, but keep in mind the new Arcane Torrent works, so you could come up with some sort of rotation if you wanted. Next to talk about is the main ingredient of phase 1, which is the ads.
Now from the pool you'll have all 3 different types of ads. You'll have a Crusher, a Blood Hexer, and 4 Krogs. The Crusher has a frontal cone, so it must be tanked facing away from other players, but most importantly it must be tanked away or at least moved away from other mobs before it reaches full energy, as it will cast Thrumming Pulse, buffing all mobs including Zul if they're within 30 yards with a 50% damage increase for 40 seconds. So although of course it is important that the guy is away from all other mobs before he does reach full energy, if any mobs that are nearby do happen to get the buff and they're very close to dying anyway, it's not too big of a deal, and of course that way you will increase the amount of damage a raid is doing because everything's stacked up. Moving on to Blood Hexes, these also need to be tanked away from Zul because of their Congeal Blood. When cast, a single Ica ad will spawn directly underneath the Blood Hexer and will start travelling towards Zul, and if they reach him, they'll just heal him for a large amount. Now the Icas can be stunned, knocked back and gripped, so you'll want to make the most of that whilst you cleave them down. The only other ability you'll notice directly on the pool is their Blood Shard cast. This deals a burst of damage to the lowest health raid member, potentially killing that target if it's not interrupted. So it's important that interrupts are solid on these mobs just to prevent any random deaths. Last to mention is the Bloodthirsty Krogs. These guys simply melee hit, so it's best to have these under Zul and just passively cleave them down. It is important however that you do not ignore these mobs because 1, they heal themselves for 200% of the damage they deal, so if your multi-dotting and cleaving on them isn't strong enough to kill them, they'll just never die. But more importantly, they do gain energy over a long period of time, and at 100% they will explode and deal massive pulsing damage to the raid over 10 seconds. So that's the ads. Let's go over what order in which to kill them and how it works across the phase.
So as you've already seen if you've been keeping a keen eye on the footage, we decided to tank the Crusher and the Blood Hexer away from Zul on one tank, moving them away 10 seconds or so after the pool just before the Crusher gains 100% energy. Whilst the other would tank Zul and the Krogs in the middle of the room. DPS just focus down the Blood Hexer, then the Crusher, whilst multi-dotters slowly bring down the dogs. And this works great. But from this point onwards, the ads will now spawn in different but set orders. In more than one instance, you'll actually have 2 Blood Hexes up at the same time. Now the issue with these guys, which we haven't already mentioned, is that they do in fact have an aura. If 2 Blood Hexes are within 20 yards of each other, they will heal all enemies for 10% of their maximum health every 2 seconds, resulting in most cases a wipe if it heals the boss at any point. Having 2 of them is problematic because the tank with Zul cannot have a Blood Hexer because of the blob ad they spawn, whilst the tank away from Zul can't have 2 of them simultaneously because of the heal aura, and this can be fixed in 2 ways. One, which isn't ideal, is 3 tanking the fight, or the second option is just to use CC. Blood Hexes technically could be crowd controlled for the entire fight. You can use things like polymorphs, hunter's traps, all those sort of things. So you'll want to CC one of them whilst you're killing the other, only breaking CC on the second one and killing it off once the previous one is dead. Meanwhile, the tanks throughout this phase just need to be shit hot at picking up the crushers and the krogs, which is difficult to do until you learn all the different spawn locations and just get used to the flow and the timings of the encounter. We actually skipped a large amount of phase 1, so we can't give you the exact order and the exact spawn locations, or go into absolutely massive detail, but do expect that coming from our live guide later on this year once the expansions actually hit. But our advice for now at least would just be kill the Hexes first, then the Crushers, and then just make sure you always have this constant multi-dot and cleave on top of the dogs, just to make sure that they die eventually before they reach 100% energy. And when you've managed to deal with all those adds and you've got the boss down to 40% health, you'll transition into phase 2.
Now from this point onwards, you'll no longer have any ads spawn, but you could still have some ads from phase 1, so it's probably best that you finish those guys off nice and quickly. And also as you transition, the boss will knock you back, so don't be too close towards the edge, otherwise yeah, everyone will laugh at you. Now you'll still have the pool of darkness to soak, but all other mechanics are new. To start off, let's talk about Death Wish, because this thing is amazing. Now this debuff is applied to 2 players, just like Dark Revelation, and the moment the debuff is applied to you, you'll lose complete control of your character, and you'll begin to walk towards the nearest edge of the platform. And once you reach the edge, you will jump off, and you will just die. Now this new debuff, fortunately, is dispellable, and when it is dispelled, it will do raid-wide damage and spawn minions of Zul, just like the Dark Revelation spell in phase 1, so it's important that you only dispel these players once they are near the edge. Now as both players will need to be dispelled almost simultaneously, you'll probably want to use healing cooldowns for each set of Death Wish debuffs just so you can survive that initial burst. You can, however, delay dispelling between each debuff by simply life gripping one of the Death Wish debuffs back towards the raid. This will give your healers an extra 5 seconds or so just to top up the group. Now as the debuff will immediately send you to the nearest edge, it is vital that you're pre-positioned, ready to go into a good direction, and this is mainly important because of the boss cleave. The boss in this phase deals more melee damage, but more importantly, it has rupturing blood. This frontal cone applies a stacking dot that lasts 20 seconds. If you get the Death Wish debuff whilst under the boss, you could potentially get hit by the cleave if you're just sent walking through him. Now the dot itself isn't too bad, the problem is that when it expires, it spawns a giant ruptured blood pool. These pools are absolutely gigantic and apply a stacking dot to anyone within them. Now whilst testing, we found that you could actually easily stack the pools, giving lots of room for people to deal with other mechanics. Our guess is that they'll actually somehow prevent you from doing this on live, so it's safe to say that you'll probably want to slowly populate the edges of the platform as you drop your tank dot. We do not know exactly what the stack number will be right now, but looking at the numbers, it'll probably be around the 5 to 6 mark. Now on top of the tank dot and the pools left behind, the Death Wish debuffs and the pool of darkness to soak, you'll notice that the raid has a stacking dot. Now the boss will apply these at the start of the phase, and you'll gain more of these if you decided to go and stand in the ruptured blood pools. Now the amount of stacks you gain is actually based on how quickly you did phase 1, so the idea is to do phase 1 nice and quickly before this stat becomes too overwhelming for your healers in phase 2. But then again, phase 2 you probably want to be using things like Bloodlust there instead, because you really want to make sure you get out of this phase before the whole fucking platform is covered in goo. So yeah, that's kind of the encounter. What do we think?
Before we talk about phase 2, we should probably talk about phase 1. The ads initially seem very overwhelming, and I think we spent a good 5 pools or so just learning exactly where the ads are spawning and how they worked. And obviously it was very catastrophic when the first 2 blood hexes spawned and they went together and were like, oh,
yeah, it's
everyone's on full health again.
You learn very quickly that stuff can go horribly wrong if you're not keeping on top of these key mechanics. But once you kind of understand, the majority of this fight is just where to position ads, at what times, and what ad should I really be killing.
Yeah.
Because you really want to maximize the amount of time that you can keep these ads stacked up. Like, ideally as close to the boss as possible so everyone can cleave it down, but then you've got to be careful of the blood echoes, you've got to be careful of the giant buff that the crushers give.
Yep.
And because the boss is so difficult to actually position because he kind of stands in place and casts quite a lot of the time, it can be hard to quickly drag him away. So something goes wrong, normally it's your own fault. You need to be constantly pre-planning. But once you've got that in your head and you know, okay, these ads have to be here at this time, the fight is actually not too difficult to do.
And looking back on the footage, we definitely could have improved on stacking up those ads. As an example, although you do want the blood hexes to be away from the boss, they can actually be quite close because the Ickers, although that they move at like normal mob speed, you can very quickly just grip them away from the boss.
Or stun them, or slow them.
Exactly,
You can do so much to them. So, in theory, like, when you do have the 2 blood hexes at once, you might even be able to bring one underneath the boss and have one just stood out there with the off-tank. Because as long as it's...
Possibly.
As long as you're quick with your stuns, you know, you can actually get that Ica in time. And maybe with good boss mod timers, you know exactly when the Ica's going to spawn. So you're going to say, oi, you, Shaman, you're going to be doing this stun exactly when it spawns. One thing that they do, I think, need to add is that when you transition into phase 2, the boss very quickly starts doing his frontal clave. And people, generally speaking, in phase 1 are kind of just surrounding the boss because you want to kind of be in all 4 quarters of the room. The boss will normally end up being towards the middle of the room anyway. So they need to give you a little bit of grace period before he starts doing his cleave, I think. Even if it's just 5 seconds or so, because we had so many pulls when we got into phase 2 where, you know, oh, suddenly 3 or 4 melee just have that debuff because they weren't pre-positioned properly. And maybe that's fine for Mythic, but I think for something like Heroic, you need to be a little bit more
considering
forgiving.
the knockback is included as you transition, it's a little bit maybe unfair that they don't give you, like, I don't know, 3 seconds just to, you know...
Make sure you're not in front of the boss, 100%. But yeah, phase 2 is very, very interesting. The whole idea of having these giant areas of denial in the room, because what you need to be thinking constantly is that you do not want the Death Wish players to be running through the pools on the ground. Because, you know, they're just going to get an absolute ton of the permanent stacking dot on them. So you've got to find a position for the entire raid to stand in where the closest edge is going to be a clear path, but it also needs to be quite a long path. So it's going to be really interesting to see exactly where guilds decide to tank the boss and how they're going to be placing these pools, because otherwise, you know, people are going to get a ton of stacks, and I can imagine it going very wrong very fast.
And additionally, to keep in mind with that debuff is the fact that it does go on 2 players, and if your raid is stacked, both those people are going to run in the same direction.
Yeah.
So when you dispel one, it's going to instantly deal damage to the other one, who's already taking damage.
Yeah.
And then you're going to dispel him, and it's going to kill both of them.
Probably, yeah.
So, you know, like we showed with the footage, using that life grip to bring that person back so you don't dispel them both at the same time, really does carry that situation. But... how many life grips are you going to have?
Well,
so you will need to rely.
Has it now, though.
Yeah, that's true. But you are going to, if you are going to rely on that strategy where you are completely stacked, you're going to need some sort of level of like using externals on those people as they move out.
Yeah.
Or even just a bit of luck and hope that someone that's, you know, positioned on the opposite side gets it instead. So the people go off in different directions. But it needs a lot of coordination from your priests with the dispels. So yeah, it's a bit of a crazy last phase, and on Mythic, this encounter is crazy. In phase 1, ads will just reincarnate unless they have a debuff on them.
But the debuff only lasts 10 seconds, and once it ends, it jumps to a new ad.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a little bit like Gorfiend on Mythic.
Yeah.
But with, like, scenario-style ads constantly.
Mythic is going to be hell.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty rough.
So we're looking forward to that one. But thank you very much, guys. If you enjoyed this little preview, then do drop us down a like. Of course, as we already said, there will be a live guide for this encounter, and we will touch more on phase 1 when we get to that point. And if you'd like to see any of the other bosses, we've done previews for absolutely every single one in Uldir. Just check out the channel, you'll find them. And before we do go, just to conclude the video, as always, we'd like to give a massive thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you for your continued support. If you'd like to join this awesome group of people, a link for that can be found in the description. But thanks for watching, and we shall see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.